It's a thrill to see all of you here tonight. Welcome. This is a big event for WAmend, and I'm really thrilled to see so many people of my own generation here. You know, young people in this society don't have the time or energy. They are so caught up in providing a living for their families that those of us, how many are retired? Those of us who are retired, who've lived long enough to retire, I think have a special obligation during this period. And it's really up to us. So I'm glad to see you. You know, it's the aftermath of the 2010 Supreme Court ruling forced an awful lot of us to recognize the futility of our oftentimes timid supplications in pursuit of reforming politics and making the world a better place. Mild reforms are just not sufficient to address the crisis of politics that we're facing today. Because our democracy problem right now is as far-reaching and much deeper than any problem that this country has ever faced before. And this is so because very powerful interests now so dominate the political scene that those petty squabbles between liberals and conservatives are mostly diversionary sideshows in a three-ring circus of corruption, of deception, and plunder. With so many of our social underpinnings under assault, it's nearly impossible not to be drawn into whatever the fight du jour is. Unfortunately, just responding to whatever that latest symptom is just doesn't work. It's no longer sufficient in this era of constant, ongoing, critical attacks. What we really need now is to make it clear, once and for all, that money is not politics, that corporations are not people, and that government is not for sale to the highest bidder. And we have to take on that task. WAmend is committed to this. We want to put a citizens' ballot initiative out for 2014. We might be too late to do that for 2014. It might have to be 2015. But if each one of you would get 10 people to promise to get 100 signatures on our petitions in the next 4 weeks, we could do it. So all you really need to do, you don't even have to sign the petition, although you're certainly welcome to do so. Go to WAmend.org, go to the sign up or get involved page, put your name down, and in the form that's on the site, tell us that you will be a recruiter of signature gatherers, and you'll find 10 or more people who can get 100 signatures each. We will be well on the road. It's so great to see Ashley and to have Move to Amend. Hopefully we're going to have a Move to Amend presence here in Seattle in the near future. And Ashley, welcome. Thank you all for being here.
Hey everybody. It's really good to be here and see all of your faces. I'm glad we have a packed house. It's always good when we need to bring in more chairs and when I see clipboards flying everywhere. So that's a good sign. And so we have a lot to cover tonight. And but before we do, I just want to give a shout out again to people who are here filming this to take community media seriously and people's media seriously, and to get this word out to people who aren't in the room tonight. So thanks to our brave, bold media people. And also, all right. And also thank you to all the organizers who made this possible, and also for WAmend for all of the sweat they've already put into this initiative, and for Jay and Libby and all the other folks who have been involved in that. It's a really tremendous effort. They are extremely organized. As an organizer, I really like to see organized organizers. And it's really incredible what they've done. And so a shout out to them. And I'm just going to reiterate that throughout the night that this is possible to collect these signatures to do a statewide ballot initiative. If Washington does it, it will be the first state to do a statewide ballot initiative demanding an amendment to the Constitution. And the rest of the nation will look to you as kind of the ringleader in getting that all started. It's a really, really exciting thing. I come from Salt Lake City, not always the easiest place to do politics. And we just got a ballot initiative on our ballot, and the votes came in on Thursday, and over 80,000 people had a chance to vote on that issue, and that's 80,000 more than would have been if we hadn't done the work. So it's extremely exciting, and I urge you to get involved. I also want to give a shout out to people in the audience who are doing good work in their own lives. So who here is an organizer or an activist? Okay. So thank you for all the work that you do to make your community better. Who here would like to be an organizer and activist? You can raise your hand. Okay, cool. So there's a future shout out to you. And this is a great way to get involved. So thank you to all the work that everybody in this room does to make this night possible, but also to bring justice into the world. And I'm going to introduce myself and move to WAmend more in just a minute. But I like to practice what I preach, and what I preach is democracy, and one of the lost arts of democracy is listening to each other. So I'd like to start the night by having you all tell me why you're here. Maybe not all of you, but having a few of you tell me why a few of you are here, and we can intuit the rest. So what I'm going to do is have you turn to your neighbor, not yet, but in a second, find a partner, a neighbor, and turn to them, and you're going to, one of you is going to be the speaker first, and you're going to tell the other person one way that corporate power negatively impacts your life. I think it's very important to practice democracy with each other, because democracy is not an institution, it's a verb. And we do it every day, or we should do it every day. And I think talking to each other helps us to break out of the isolation that the corporate media and corporate influence of our lives puts us in, and helps us to feel like we're understood, and that it's okay to be outraged, and that we can be powerful together. So I believe that, well, I'll ask you all, who here is outraged by corporate control of their lives? Okay, then you're all in the right room, because I'm outraged too. And I believe that outrage is the appropriate response to hundreds of years of abuse, manipulation, and exploitation. Outrage is a good response to that. I believe that outrage, when it sits in you and you don't move, turns to poison. So I'm here to channel outrage into action, because I believe that action is the antidote to outrage at your government. So that's what we're here to do today. We're going to talk about history, but the goal is action. And I'm going to make myself play my own game, because that's democracy too, right? And I'm going to tell you why I'm here. Libby told you a little bit about what I do, but why do I do it? And my story, or one of my stories, is that I come from Salt Lake City. Has anybody here been to Salt Lake City? Okay. Wow, all the Washingtonians have been to Salt Lake City a lot. So you can probably answer this question. In the winter, if you went there in the winter, what color is the sky? Or what color is the air? Okay, that's already a frightening question. What color is the air? Someone said brown? Okay, it is brown. It can be lots of different colors. I call it a radioactive rainbow soup. And we live in that. And on any given day, I live in a city with the most air pollution in the world. And some days, you can really tell that that's true. It was so bad that when I was growing up, I wasn't allowed to go out for recess, because the air was too toxic to breathe. People in my community die years earlier because of breathing in that toxic air, and many, many children and elderly people have asthma. And I remember when I was little, my teacher asked us to draw pictures of the future, and I guess I was feeling in a particularly dystopic mood that day, because I used all my black and brown crayons to draw the sky, and then I drew a picture of myself with a gas mask on. And she probably thought I was a disturbed child until 20 years later, I was on my way to school, and I looked next to my car at the light, and I saw a woman on her bike with a gas mask so that she could breathe. So I felt vindicated, and I wanted to write my teacher, but I don't know where she is. And I was so angry about that. I thought, we have to wear masks because the air that we live in is so toxic. Why? Why is that? And as I started researching, I found out that one of the reasons is that the world's largest open pit copper mine is in my backyard. Rio Tinto Kennecott, anybody heard of it? And they make $14 billion a year profiting off of mines that kill people all around the world. Kill workers and also kill people who breathe the air around those mines, kill animals. And they're making lots of money at their London headquarters, and we're breathing lots of dirty air where I live. And so I decided to take action on air quality and a lot of other issues that mattered to me, and I did everything that my high school civics teacher told me to do. So thanks to high school teachers. And I organized and I educated, and I had myself be educated by other people, and we went to meet with officials, and we went to meetings, and we would go to regulatory meetings about the expansion of this mine, and we would pack the room, 400 people in the room, you know, moms saying no, babies wearing onesies that said, "Don't kill me," you know, we weren't messing around with our messaging. And all these citizens arrayed in protest against this mine. And every single time we lost. Every single time they expanded the mine. And after that happened, for years and years, I realized that the whole thing was a foregone conclusion. Corporations were more important than people. They were going to win, and we were going to watch. And our presence there basically put a veneer of democracy on a sham. And we were there to legitimize the seizure of our rights right in front of our faces. So I said, I'm not going to do that anymore. Or actually what I said is, I am still going to do this, work on immediate issues that are important to me, but I'm going to also work on root causes of the problem, because if we don't solve the root cause of corporate power, we don't have a prayer in solving the immediate things that we need to solve to live basic, healthy, and productive and happy lives. And so I got involved with a group called Democracy Unlimited, and in 2010, after the Citizens United decision, we formed Move to Amend. And that's my way of working on structural change while also working on immediate, necessary, urgent change. And I think all those things have to happen and feed into each other for us to win justice and win equality. So what is Move to Amend? Who here already knows what Move to Amend is? Okay, so a lot of folks don't. I'm going to tell you what it is, and we're going to spend the rest of the night figuring out why it is. Why does it exist? Why do we have the strategies we have? What's this all about? So Move to Amend is a national, grassroots, multi-racial, different geography, different income coalition of almost 300,000 people and almost 200 affiliates who are saying no to the corporate takeover of our lives and our government, and who are organizing to amend the Constitution of the United States to say that corporations are not human beings and that money is not speech. So I was speaking to a class of elementary kids about corporate power a while back, and I said, I'm trying to amend the Constitution to say corporations are not people. And a little kid said, duh. And so I always think about that kid whenever I speak, because it is duh. Sometimes I'm almost insulted that I have to be working on this issue because it's so crazy. It's obvious. When people don't know that it's already an issue, when you say the sentence to them, they're like, wait, what are you, I don't understand what you're working on. And so, but what we're really after is starting a conversation about corporate power in our lives and about democracy. So Move to Amend's first goal is amending the Constitution. And people come up to me on the street sometimes, and they approach me like they're going to give me a tip, and they do, and they say, hey, did you know that amending the Constitution is really hard? And I say, oh, it is? You should totally help then. I feel really overwhelmed. You should get involved. But the fact is that at Move to Amend, we know that amending the Constitution is a huge deal. And we take our playbook from past movements for social justice, the abolitionists, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, farm workers movements, all the movements that make our country something that I can be proud to talk about in a room full of people. And But we also know that amendments don't just happen overnight, and so our second goal is actually much bigger than an amendment, and it's necessary for an amendment to happen, and that's that we want to build a democracy movement. A movement of people who are affected by corporate power, a movement that cuts across issues. Whatever you care about is affected by corporate power and would be benefited by more democracy. So a movement that cuts across issues, and also a movement that recognizes explicitly the way that corporations have created and perpetrated and exacerbated things like racism, classism, and sexism to keep us apart and keep us from forming movements that actually threaten their power and that have disproportionately harmed so many people, and that have harmed all of us, but harmed some of us a little bit less so that we don't see our solidarity and alliance with other people. So we're a movement that wants to build across issues and across lines that normally divide us to build power that is so strong that a corporate-occupied Congress and a corporate-occupied country can no longer ignore us, that they have to concede to our demands. So we're about grassroots, movement building, structural change, and broad-based vision of the world that we actually want to live in. So does that sound good to you folks? Okay, awesome. So tonight we're going to dig into some history, and that might be strange because you might say, well, I graduated from high school 20 years ago, 50 years ago. Why do I need a history lesson? I think that we need history lessons because history is the story of power and how power operates. Who decides, who loses, and whose story gets told. And I think if we know the stories that people in power don't want us to know, we'll be better equipped to act in the present in the name of justice and equality. So this is a story tonight about how corporations got their power and how people have always formed social movements to fight the power of the moneyed and the wealthy and the unjust to build justice for themselves and for their brothers and sisters across the world. So we're going to talk about that, and I'm going to do a long history. We're talking 500 years in a very short amount of time. And then we're going to actually finish that history by teaching each other the history, because I don't think that I know everything. Some people I know might think that I do, but I don't. And I think that you know a lot. So we're going to spend part of the night teaching each other, why is Move to Amend's goal amending the Constitution? Why do we need to do that? And why do we need to build a democracy movement? What are movements all about? And why does the movement have to actually fight and heal the wounds of racism and classism and sexism in order to win and in order to be just? And we're going to dig into why we need to do that together by creating people's timelines. Hopefully a lot of you will be participating in that by the end of the evening. But first I'm going to give you some background, and we're going to race through history really fast. So let's take this metaphor that a corporation is a person, this tortured, distorted metaphor. Let's take it seriously for a second, and let's start with that and say if a corporation is a person, then corporations have a birthday, right? People have birthdays. So can somebody in the audience tell me when the modern corporate form was born? I'm not asking right now when corporations got personhood, because we'll talk about that. But right now I'm asking when the modern corporate form was born. Yes, right around then. So the modern corporate form came into existence around the 1500s, that century. And something was going on in the 1500s around the world. Rich men in Europe were sending out ships to foreign lands in an age that historians often euphemistically call the age of what? Exploration or discovery, right? So I believe that history happens in the euphemisms and the fancy phrases. So tonight's going to be breaking apart euphemisms and fancy phrases. The age of exploration is a mega euphemism. What was actually happening at that time? What was it actually the age of? Age of what? Exploitation, conquest, slavery, empire. Okay, we've made a good short list of depressing words, and they're all correct. So it was the age of mass imperialism, colonization, exploitation, and as a result, the age of genocide and slavery. So the corporate form actually grew up at the same time as the age of colonization. Is that an accident? No. What is it about the corporate form that makes it the perfect vehicle for mass colonization? Or, in other words, to do something to people en masse that you would have a really hard time justifying doing face-to-face? Okay, removes liability. And I see another hand back there. Okay, so exploitation of labor and limitation of liability. Those are two really good answers. The corporate form is a form that actually institutionalizes irresponsibility and incentivizes violence and keeps the individual who perpetuates it unaccountable and maybe even unaware of what they're doing. And so it's a perfect vehicle for mass violence, right? And how did this happen? What is it about the corporation that makes it that perfect form? And to answer that, we're going to have to talk about some of those men in Europe who wanted to become incorporated so that they could go out and colonize and exploit. And these men were, as they often are, just a few small but very powerful white European men. And they said, hey, I hear there's a new world out there, new to us at least, and we want to go and make a ton of money, but we've heard one thing, which is that people don't really like being exploited. It's just this thing. And so it's pretty risky to go and conquer whole swaths of the globe. So what we want is to make as much money as possible without a lot of risk. How can we do that? And they sat and they scratched their heads and they thought, who can help us? And then they thought, ding, ding, ding. That guy who always helps us when we have a problem, our friend, our pal, the king. We're going to go to the king and see if he can help us out. So they trotted over to the palace. And the king's sitting there boo-hooing because he's been fighting lavish wars and throwing lavish parties, and his treasury's not looking as hot as it used to. And so he's saying, oh man, how can I get more rich? And the economic elites knock at his door. They come in, they have a meeting. Whenever in history you hear about a secret meeting between economic and political elites, you know the rest of the story is not going to go well for common people. And that's exactly the case in this story, because the economic elites came in and they said, look, we want to make a lot of money without a lot of risk. And the king said, oh great, I want to make a lot of money and I don't want to work. So what can we do for each other? And the king said, I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you what's called a corporate charter, your birth certificate, if you're people. I'm going to give you a corporate charter that's going to allow you to live forever, and I'm also going to sweeten the pot with a little something called limited liability. Can somebody in the audience, without making us all feel like we accidentally signed up for a law school class, tell me what limited liability is? Okay, so there's no risk beyond what you initially invest. That's a really good answer. And that means if I started a corporation and I needed money, I said, hey, Paul, can you give me $10,000? And he says, sure. And then I take the money and I incorporate and I start puttering around the Gulf of Mexico, and oh no, my oil rig explodes, kills workers, and spills millions of barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, devastates economies and ecosystems. And I say, hey, Paul, we're in a lot of trouble. Can you help me out? And Paul says, nope. I just donated $10,000. That's all I did. Good luck. So the whole form itself actually says that individual people are wrested from their responsibility for the consequences of their actions. So it's really terrifying. And if you have a corporation that's incredibly powerful, it's even more terrifying. And that's what the king and the economic elites of Europe created when they met over the course of however many years, way back when. So let's stop for a second in this story and identify some core features of the modern corporation, because you might recognize them as being alive and well today. So one of them we already mentioned, which is that the corporate form incentivizes irresponsibility and is a perfect vehicle for mass imperialism and colonization. There are a couple other features I think are really important. Often we hear of corporations as free market success stories. Who's heard that before? Yeah, okay. But the reality is that the corporation cannot exist without the express legal, political, and military backing of the state. So the corporation is a creature of the state, a creature of law. And why is that important? Sounds pretty boring. I think it's important because serious social movements throughout time have recognized that power is not inevitable, it's constructed. And that's good news, because if power is constructed and you don't like it, you can deconstruct it and construct another kind of power. And that's important to me because I'm 31. I've lived 31 years under extreme corporate capitalism. And for me, it's very easy to say, well, that's just how it is. People get paid nothing at their jobs. We enslave masses of the population. Food comes from the grocery store. It's usually poisoned. I breathe bad air. That's just how it is. But it isn't how it is. It was how it was created by people who had very deliberate strategies and motives for creating that. So that will be important as we come back later and talk about what we as people can do about this problem. The third thing that I think is really important in this story is that oppression, or tyranny, as our friends in the revolutionary period often referred to it as, is always political and economic. It's a deal between political and economic elites. And if you want to create bad power, power over other people, you better have your political and your economic sides of that power down. And if you want to resist bad power and create good power, people power, you need to have a movement that recognizes both economic and political tyranny or oppression. And the corporation is essentially one of the best metaphors, or one of the most terrifying realities that we have, of concentrated economic and political tyranny in one form. Right? Okay, so there we are. That's the birth of the modern corporation, and we're going to jump forward 250 years to talk about democracy. But before we do, I want to say one more thing, which is that throughout this story that I'm going to tell, there's a theme. And the theme is people in power organize to exploit and harm other people for profit, and people who are being exploited and harmed organize to resist. And that's the theme of history. That's one theme of history. And I'm on the latter side. I don't know about you all, or I think I know about you all. And so this story will be about both corporate power and democracy the whole time. So let's jump forward 250 years and come to a place called the 13 colonies across the Atlantic in what would become the United States of America. And I want to ask you another trivia question, which is, can somebody tell me what the most powerful corporation was at the time that the American Revolution was heating up? The British East India Company. You guys are real smart. WAmend's been doing their job. That's awesome. The British East India Company. The British East India Company is so powerful. I mean, just think of the most powerful transnational corporation you can today. Walmart, fill in the blank. The British East India Company made that corporation look like a toddler in diapers. The British East India Company was so powerful that it controlled whole swaths of the globe in corporate fiefdoms. It had its own fleet of ships that rivaled the British Navy. It had its own court system, because why should rich people have to abide by the same laws as us? And to sweeten the pot, the majority of the members of British Parliament owned stock in the British East India Company. So why is that important? You came to talk about Citizens United. Why am I telling you about a bunch of ships? It's important because the British East India Company was related to the British Parliament through these financial dealings. And that makes the story of the American Revolution make a lot more sense. Because when I was growing up in high school, my teacher, and I think a lot of teachers will accept, is Alan your name? Okay, you probably don't tell this story, which is great, but my teacher told me this story. They told me that the American Revolution was about two things. One was that people really didn't like one particular guy who liked to sit on gold thrones and order people around. Who was that? King George III. So they wanted to get rid of King George III and monarchs in general. And my teacher also told me that a lot of the people in the American Revolution were very angry about taxation without what? Representation. The fact that we can all say that answer means that someone really wanted us to know that and think that that was the reason for the American Revolution. And those were two reasons that people fought the American Revolution. But guess what? Just like now, back then, not everybody agreed. And there were a lot of people who fought the American Revolution for a lot of different reasons. And to understand some reasons that we don't often hear, we're going to have to figure out this connection between the British East India Company and Parliament. So the British East India Company was just one of many corporations who were cruising around the 13 original colonies making a lot of money. Let's talk about that. Often I say the phrase 13 original colonies so many times, I did growing up, that I was like, oh yeah, 13 original colonies, blah, 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 blah. What's a colony? Chartered? Okay. By the king? Okay, that's very important. So why do empires want colonies? What? Extract resources. Okay, colonies are very valuable for empires because they are a source of raw materials, resources, and labor for the empire. And so the 13 original colonies, my teacher told me that they were about freedom of religion and freedom of political expression. Some people came there for that reason, but mostly what they were about were profit-making enterprises. 12 of the original 13 colonies at some point were actually corporate charters. That means, like you said, that they were chartered by the king and given to rich men to control as if they were a corporation to make money. So the colony was a corporation, and the governor was essentially a CEO. So if you're a CEO of a corporation or a colony, and you want to make a lot of money, who do you have to bring over to the United States or the 13 colonies to do your work for you? Because I don't know if you all have heard, but rich people don't like doing their own work. It's just a thing. So they have to bring people over, right? So who do they bring over? So slaves, indentured servants, political prisoners, orphans. Is that who said orphans? Great, so not great, I mean terrible, but right. Debtors, okay, so debtors, orphans, for the crime of vagrancy, which is essentially, as far as I can tell, being poor in public. So they brought these people over to do the work of the corporate taskmasters of the American colonies. And so these people who were brought over and enslaved or indentured had to know something about power and how it worked. What do they know? They knew that power is political and economic because they looked at the CEO and they realized he was the same guy as the governor. And they realized he was making a lot of money off of their backs, and that the things that made him a lot of money were incorporated into law by legislatures that invested in him. So they saw this connection. Does that sound familiar to people? Happening now, right? Okay, so when the American Revolution starts heating up and there are a bunch of rich merchants in Boston saying, we need to get represented when we're taxed and we need to get rid of the king, a lot of people in the poorer parts of the colonies had a good belly laugh, and they're like, you think that's gonna solve your problem? We have a bigger idea. And a lot of those people had a lot of bigger ideas. Can some people tell me what some of the demands of American revolutionaries were beyond the end of taxation without representation and the end to monarchy? Okay, full enfranchisement, regardless of how much land you own or how important you are. Freedom, okay, so that's a big one. Freedom, equality, justice, yeah. Exactly, freedom of the press. There were a lot of other demands. I'll just list a few. People basically democratized the military so that they had an incredible amount of say in the military. They would stop foreclosures of their friends' lands when rich people came to foreclose on them. So they had a demand to end foreclosures of small farmers' lands. There were enslaved Africans who escaped slavery and started free colonies. There were people who were fighting for paper currency, the elimination of debt, and equal distribution of wealth and land to every person. And of course, there were indigenous people who were already here who were saying, hey, this is actually our land, so give it back. So there was that too. Incredible demands that are pretty big and that go way beyond just deposing a king. And this tension was there, once again, between wealth and wealthy people in the United States, or the 13 colonies, and the regular people who fought in the Revolution as well, and then also the fight against tyranny in Britain. And so that helps us to understand a lot about things like the Boston Tea Party, which I heard a lot about in school as well. I guess if you don't like a king, you just throw a bunch of his tea in the harbor and he cries and then you got a revolution. Why? Why, if you don't like the king, are you going to throw a bunch of tea in the harbor? That doesn't make a lot of sense unless we recognize that the colonists explicitly connected the taxes on tea and other commodities as being a mechanism of colonization that was brought to them by a union of the political and the economic elite. So they recognized that. These taxes weren't so onerous that they were saying, I couldn't possibly go on. Not one more tax on tea. They were saying, I could pay this tax, but I refuse because I see it as an example of the union between economic and political interests and the takeover of my everyday life and my ability to have liberty. And so the American Revolution was always explicitly both anti-monarchical and anti-corporate. It was against concentrated political tyranny in the form of the king and concentrated economic tyranny in the form of the corporation. And so we fought a war, and particularly poor people fought the war. And when the war was over and the dust settled and the common enemy was gone, people looked around and they said, maybe I, a poor yeoman farmer in Massachusetts, don't actually have a lot in common with this wealthy merchant in Boston. And so these schisms started to form, and the wealthy merchants got together and they approached the Articles of Confederation Congress and they said, hey, do you think that we could maybe get together and have a meeting about whether the trade needs of the trade needs of the country are being met by the trade laws in the Articles of Confederation? And the Congress said something to the effect of, yeah, sounds super boring, knock yourselves out. And so they went and they gathered in a little town called Philadelphia, and they closed the door and they talked for a long time, and instead of writing up some trade suggestions, they wrote something else. What did they write? The Constitution of the United States. And when they got together to write that Constitution, they made some speeches at the beginning, and you can read them. They're archives. And they basically said, we're here today because we're really terrified about one phenomenon that's happening around us. One thing. We want to quash one thing in particular. Does anybody know what that thing was? Anarchy? Another word for that they used? Yeah. Democracy. Rad. How old are you? That's awesome. That is the exact right answer. Thanks for coming. So I would not have known that answer when I was little. So democracy. They wanted to quash democracy. Why? Weren't they all about democracy? What were they about? Power, money. They had a lot of speculation in Western lands. They wanted the gold standard. They wanted to make a killing, literally and figuratively, off of the investments that they'd made in the war. They wanted to protect their property. And they got together and they did just that. One historian called the Constitutional Convention the first NAFTA, because it was a meeting of the wealthiest people in the country in secret to standardize trade across borders for the consolidation of wealth for economic elites. And I'm not here to burst all your democracy balloons. That's not like my favorite hobby. I'm here because we have to tell an honest story about this so that we can know how to react to our history and how to create our future. And so when this Constitution was written, and it came out to be ratified by all the regular people who wanted an end to foreclosures and an end to debt and all these other things, what did these regular people think about the Constitution? Did they like it? Awesome. Okay, so this is extremely important. They demanded that one thing happen before they ratified it, that something be added to the Constitution. We just heard it up here. Anybody else know? The Bill of Rights. When I was younger, I thought, man, what sloppy people. They just didn't get around to it and they had to add on stuff at the end. Come on, you guys. You get a C. But really, the Bill of Rights came out of a robust people's movement that was fighting these merchants who had fought against the king. They had fought against tyranny far away, but they didn't mind so much assuming power in their own home, their own country. And these regular people were fighting that and saying, no, I did not fight a revolution to get a property document. I fought for my political and economic sovereignty. And so you better pass a Bill of Rights or I'm not going to ratify that. And so those were their demands. And so when I say that, because when I talk about what it means to be an American, I don't often say that phrase, because there are a lot of things to not be proud of. But when I talk about things I am proud of to be an American, I'm actually talking about mostly the Bill of Rights. Not as much the Constitution. What kind of things am I talking about? We listed them before. Freedom of what? Speech, religion, press, assembly, freedom from search and seizure, right? I'm talking about basic political protections. And those things were brought to us by a robust people's movement that fought against concentrated wealth at the formation of this country for their basic economic and political sovereignty. So there's that tradition still, that tension always between concentrated wealth and corporate capital and democracy. And the people fought for that. And let's ask ourselves one more question before we move on to how corporations actually got personhood. And this will help us move into that conversation. What three words start the Constitution of the United States? We the people. So that's a pretty poetic phrase, and there's a pretty poetic paragraph that comes after it. But technically, if a lawyer had gotten a hold of that, he would have been like, actually, it's we the legal persons, right? It's we the legal persons. Because what do legal persons get in a democracy? Standing. Recognition as a legal being, and you said the word rights a lot. A legal person gets access to rights enumerated in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They also get cultural legitimacy that comes from being considered a legal person. So can somebody tell me in this great democratic moment, or what is sold to us as this great democratic moment in our history, the writing of the Constitution, what percentage of the population qualified for the protections of legal persons? 1%. So I heard 1%. You said 1? What? 8? 10? What? Okay, so we have a lot of pretty accurate guesses here. Let's make a list first before we answer, before we reveal. Who did it not include? Women. Who else? Okay, African people. Non-property owners. Indigenous people. Irish people, basically a lot of people that the state didn't like or that were threatening to the state. So the answer is about 5 to 8% of the population actually qualified for protections of we the people. 5 to 8% people. So in the Occupy movement, we talk about being the 99%. These are the original 95% of people who did not count. And what do you think they thought of that? Were they fine with it? And the historian Molly Ivins, the writer, has said that the history of this country can be viewed as the history of all the people who didn't count the first time around, forming social movements to drive themselves into the phrase, we the people. So again, there's that tension. And once again, the history of this country that I'm proud of is the history of all those people who refused to accept that they weren't people, and who said, no, being a person is a sacred thing to be, and having rights is non-negotiable, and we will form social movements to drive ourselves into the law and change the culture so that we're recognized as persons. So that is an extremely, I can't even emphasize enough the importance of that tradition in our country, and that's going to be really important when we talk in just a minute about why corporations wanted to be people, why they wanted in on that tradition. So we talked about protections from political tyranny, but we started the story by asserting that, or I asserted to you, that all power is both political and economic. So what did people in the early revolutionary period do to protect themselves from economic tyranny after the Constitution was written? They got rid of the king, they had the Bill of Rights, and they said, well, that's not enough, because what if British East India Company comes back and starts bossing us around? What are we going to do about that? So they got together and they created some basic people's laws that asked the democratic question, which is, who decides? Who is sovereign? They asked, is the economy for us, or do we exist for the economy? Do we exist for a few people to make a buck? And they said, well, I think that the economy exists for us, so we're going to pass some really basic laws to protect our right to govern what our economy looks like. And we're going to go through that quickly, and then we're going to dig into corporations getting personhood. Let's compare it to what happens now. Right now, who wants to be our volunteer to start a corporation in Seattle? We won't make you into a bad guy. Okay, so you're going to start a corporation in Seattle. You don't have to do anything. Well, you kind of do, but you can sit down. We want you to be comfortable. So you start a corporation. Does anybody know, do you know, or does anybody here know what it takes for you to start a corporation in Seattle? Okay. Okay, so you file, you write some bylaws, you apply, and you pay some money. In Utah, it's $50, I think. $71, not a lot of money.
For an LCC.
For an LCC, okay. So you do that and bam, you have a corporation. Congratulations, you have a corporation. And how long can your corporation live? So yeah, you can exist forever. Let's compare that to the first 75 years of this country. If you wanted to incorporate in the first 75 years of this country, what did you have to do? Anyone, by raise of hand? How about that? You had to go to the state legislature and have them write a law saying that you could exist. And in order for them to do that, you had to prove one thing to them, and that is that you served the public good. Take a second, think about it. Picture your least favorite transnational corporation. How many of them could even get past the gate if that was the only requirement about what they did? That's pretty powerful. People from the beginning, from jump, said, corporations exist for us. We're going to make sure they do. That's one way we do it. Back in the first 75 years of the country, how long could a corporation exist? 30 years? Till it fulfilled its purpose. What? Till their job's done? Okay, so those are all accurate answers. Corporate charters lasted from 3 to 50 years, or until the corporation's job that it applied to do was over. How powerful is that? 3 to 7 years, that was bank charters. People didn't like banks very much. So weird. And so people said banks last 3 to 7 years. Imagine if Goldman Sachs came to us, the American people, after the financial crash with their begging bowl and said, please, sir, could we have another charter? Would you give it to them? Would you say, your boss said get out? I would say get out. So people had held corporations accountable. Every few years, corporations had to prove that they were serving the public good and doing their job. Let's keep going. So your corporation, what kind of work can you do? What kinds of things can you sell?
Products.
Products, that's a good answer. Anything, right? Anything. In the first 75 years of the country, you were incorporated to do one task, like build a bridge or a road or a canal. And when that was over, your corporation went back into public hands. Nowadays, you can make however much money you're able to make. And back in the first 75 years of this country, you could make a certain amount and your corporation became public because it belonged to the people, because the people helped to fund it. So all these laws, it went on and on. Shareholders had to be local. They had to live with the consequences of their decisions. There were no mergers. Books had to be open so people could read what the corporation was up to. And maybe most importantly for our purposes tonight, until 1850 on the books of many states, it was a felony for corporations to contribute a single penny in elections. A felony. It's a pretty serious crime. People who had lived through the revolution saw so clearly how quickly economic and political elite interests combined that they said, we're not going to let that happen on our watch. We're going to make it a felony for economic elites to give their money to political elites because that means tyranny for regular people. So that's pretty powerful. We talked about how power was constructed. This is how people, regular people, constructed their power to serve them instead of moneyed interests. So how does that make people feel in this crowd, hearing that story? Huh? Jealous. I heard jealous, hopeful, good. Okay, we don't have to do it exactly the same. Maybe we would do it differently. But the point is that there was a time in our country's history where people exercised real structural sovereignty over what their economy looked like and also what their political system looked like. And we can do that again. It's not impossible. There's a joke that corporate historian Jane Ann Morris tells that says, don't know if the mine in your backyard is bad for you? Hire an expert to prove that it isn't. So right now we live in the regulatory state where we think we have to be an expert to know if a copper mine, for example, is bad for our health. We don't need to be an expert. We have our experiences. We know that the smog we're breathing is bad for our lungs. We know that the dead fish in the water are trying to say something to us, right? We know our own experience, and we should be able to legislate from a basic sense of reality, not from a marble hall or because we've read every single right book, right? And that was what people said back then. We're experts of our own experience. We should have a say in our democracy and in our economy, and we say that we're in charge. The democratic answer. Who's in charge? We are. And so that was pretty powerful. So what happened? That's the story we're going to tell to each other for the rest of the night. And what happened is power always wants more power. Corporations didn't like having people have power over them, so they got together and they said, feeling so claustrophobic in this democracy, what can we do? And they went to the legislators and they said, hey, why don't you lessen those restrictions? And the legislator said, yeah, there's still a good old boys club going on, but you don't pay for my election, so why should I listen to you? And they shooed them out of the building. So corporations thought, what can we do to get more power, to lessen these restrictions and to control the economy and the political system? And while they were thinking about it, something that was very good for corporations happened, a little old something called the Civil War. Can someone tell me why war is good for corporations? Munitions. Okay, yeah, replacing materials, labor, goods. So during the Civil War, a few corporations got incredibly powerful. Banking corporations, because the war had to be financed, and railroad and ammunition corporations, because the goods had to be transported. And when the war was over, everybody had been busy looking over here, and all this dastardly stuff was happening over here. The war ends, they look back and they say, what were we thinking? One of those people was Abraham Lincoln, and he wrote a letter to his friend, and he said, and I'll convert it into teen talk, he basically said, you know how worried I was about the fate of the Union? Well, that's nothing compared to how worried I am now about the power of giant corporations and their ability to basically tear us under this democracy. That's Abraham Lincoln. He let it happen on his watch. He had no reason to call himself out like that, and he had every good reason in the world to be worried because these corporations used the power that they got in war to go back to the legislatures and say, hey, how about lessening those restrictions? But still, the legislators were pretty slow. They weren't really doing what the corporations wanted, so the corporations said, okay, we have to take this more seriously. We have to go to the next level. We need to go to the least accountable, least democratic, and frankly, most boring, no offense to the lawyers out there, branch of government in the triumvirate of the federal government. What branch is that? The judicial, right? Not many people are glued to court TV saying, what is going to happen to that tax fence case? I'm just up at night. I'm so stressed, right? So they said it's going to be a lot easier to convince 9 unelected judges that we are people than it is to convince millions of Americans that we are. So we're going to take our issue to the courts. And they said, what are we going to argue in the courts? And then they remember how great it is to be a legal person in a democracy. Because legal people get rights. So if we, with all of our power and our might and our control that we already have, we're also people, we could use our rights as a trump card over regular living, breathing people whenever they got too powerful for us to control in other ways. That sounds awesome. And so that is exactly what they did. They went to the Supreme Court and they argued that they were people. And we're going to tell that story together right now and figure out what happened. So what I have here is a timeline of corporate rights, the rights that corporations got through the Supreme Court, through the law. And I need about 15 volunteers to take one of these cards. There's a date on it, to look at the date, and then to get in order according to the date with the most distant date back here and the most recent date on this side. And then you're going to read these out loud for people so we can learn from each other about how corporations got the rights that only human beings should have and what rights they got. So who can volunteer for me? All right, come on up if you want to volunteer and I'll just hand these to you.
Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, 1886. Without any formal argument, the court declares a corporation a person with the same rights as human beings. They grant them the 14th Amendment right to equal protection that was supposed to protect the recently emancipated black folks. Justices have since struck down hundreds of local, state, and federal laws enacted to protect people from corporation harm because these discriminate against corporations.
That's really important. The Supreme Court the corporations used a specific amendment to argue that they were people under the law. Did you hear which one it was? 14th. The 14th protects people from discrimination. And it was the result of years of struggle on the part of one group that didn't count during the writing of the Constitution, African Americans who had been enslaved, who had formed a social movement with their white allies to drive themselves into the Constitution. They got into the Constitution, they forced an amendment through, and corporations used that amendment. How cynical can you get? That amendment to say, oh no, this amendment wasn't supposed to apply to these vulnerable, formerly disenfranchised people. It's supposed to apply to us. And the other thing that's interesting is that it was never argued. Did people hear that? That it was never argued in front of a court? Corporations came up, or corporate executives came to the court and they said, they used these really boring cases. If you ever want to sleep at night, read through these cases. And they said, okay, so don't tax these fences, do tax these fences. Also, I'm a person under the law. And they'd done this a few times without any success. And in 1886, they were about to make the same argument. And one judge on the court said, today I don't want to hear about whether corporations are people or not. Indeed, we are all of the opinion that they are. I don't know who he thought everyone was. He wasn't talking about the masses of American people who had no idea that this was going on, or the Congress where this should have been decided. He said that, and I heard it back here, a court reporter wrote it down. The court reporter was a railroad man himself, wrote it down into the head notes of the case. It was never formally argued, and bam, that is how corporations became people under the law. It was never decided by the actual court. It shouldn't have been in the Supreme Court in the first place, and corporations pounced on that and started using that as precedent to say that they had 14th Amendment rights against discrimination. But what does that mean? First of all, boo hiss, right? Boo hiss. What does that mean? Because it's a wonky phrase, right? History's in the wonky phrases. One thing that it means is if a coal corporation, for example, wanted to move into your town, have you ever wondered why you can go to endless meetings about how high the smokestacks could be or how much they can poison you and maybe poison you a little bit less, but you can't just say what is your basic right in a democracy to say, which is no, I don't want the coal corporation in my town. Why should I have to? The one reason for that is if you said that, the coal corporation could come back and sue the city and say that you are discriminating against it the same way that you would be discriminating if you said, oh, I don't want a gay person living in my condo, in my housing association. So they use discrimination that's supposed to protect regular people to protect themselves at the expense of regular people. So we can't say simple things like yes and no, because that violates the rights of the corporation. All right, so next one.
Hale versus Henkel, 1906. Corporations get Fourth Amendment search and seizure protections. Corporations use this right to demand that regulators get warrants before they can inspect businesses for violations of labor and environmental laws.
We're just doing musical chairs here. So corporations got Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure. What does that mean? One thing it means is 14th Amendment means we can't pass robust laws that say yes or no. But the laws we are allowed to pass, these alphabet soup regulatory kind of regulations, when we go to enforce them, we send an inspector in to say, how are you treating your workers? Or are you dumping toxic sludge in the river? The corporate executive can say, oh no, the corporation is a person. You can't come in here and inspect to see whether or not I'm following the law, because that's a violation of my Fourth Amendment search and seizure protections. So we can't even enforce the laws that we do pass. So that's pretty critical. All right, next.
The year is 1919, and the case is Dodge versus Ford Motor Company. The Michigan Supreme Court rules that a corporation exists to maximize the profits of its shareholders, regardless of the impacts on the planet, the economy, or health and safety. This ruling mandates perpetual growth and practically guarantees human and environmental abuses.
What happened?
The Michigan Supreme Court affirms what everybody here already knows, that corporations don't exist to help the common good. Corporations exist for one purpose, and that's to make money.
So thank you for reading. So that is a critical moment. I often think instead of having a laugh track, we should have a wah track for when we hear this, a scream track, like, oh no. Because what's your name?
Jonathan.
Jonathan just read is that it's not that corporations just make money or even that they try really hard to make a profit at our expense. It is that they are legally required to maximize profit for shareholders. So what happens if you have to maximize profits? Can you pay your workers well? No, that gets in the way of profits. Can you protect the environment? No, it gets in the way of profits. So we have essentially created a Frankenstein that serves the interests of a few and has turned against all of the rest of us, right? And it's really terrifying because it takes it from the personal to the structural. Because, you know, the Dalai Lama himself could be in charge of Walmart and he couldn't do anything differently than the current CEO is doing, right? Because he is required to make a profit. So this is basically the law about the corporate form. Profit at any cost.
Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahan, 1922. Corporations get Fifth Amendment protections against the government taking their property without compensation. They use this right to argue that any law that impacts their ability to make maximum profit is a taking, and they can sue to recoup all the profits that they were making and would have made if the law hadn't passed. So this says that now, you know, if I'm a corporation and I think an environmental law or a public safety law is going to impact my ability to make money, I'm going to sue you and get that sucker off the books.
That's right. Okay. And even more, not just sue you, but sue you for all the money that I was making and all the money I would have made. That is a lot of zeros at the end of that number, right? It's incredible. They've essentially said that a law takes their property and violates their Fifth Amendment rights so that they can get back all the money that they would have made if the law had not been passed. So that's huge, right? Because what kind of laws can you pass in your community if you think that the corporation is just going to turn around and sue you for everything you've got? It's a total chilling effect on democracy. And it's extremely dangerous. And it also has psychological effects. Law influences culture, and culture influences law. So when these laws pass, they not only give power to corporations, they also limit what we as political people, as Americans, think that we have a right to. They limit the scope of what conversations we can have, so we have all the wrong conversations instead of the big conversations that we need to have to protect the planet and each other.
This is Lewis K. Leggett Company versus Lee, 1933. The people of Florida passed a law that levied higher taxes on chain stores than local businesses. The Supreme Court overturned it because it discriminated against chain stores and violated megacorporations' 14th Amendment rights to equal protection. Because everyone gets equal protection because megacorporations are people. It just goes back to the same, that old, some of us are more equal than others kind of phrase.
Exactly. Okay, so 14th Amendment, back there, right? Your good buddy back there. He helped you get the 14th Amendment if you were a corporate executive. We know you're not. And now you use it to say, oh, you want to grow a local economy because that is more beneficial for mom and pop businesses and for people who live in the community. Too bad. It violates megacorporations' 14th Amendment rights. But let's reverse that a little bit and say, how many taxes are these megacorporations paying these days? Some of them $0. $0. How many taxes are you paying? What? Subsidies, exactly. So they don't mind so much when the hypocrisy goes the other way. A very important point to remember. Go for it.
All right. We're up to 1976, Buckley versus Vallejo. The Supreme Court rules that corporations have First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. Since corporations do not have mouths to speak with, the court rules that they speak by spending money in elections. This opened the door to a glut of corporate spending in the political process. It's pretty clear. I'm surprised that was in my lifetime, actually. 1976, you can spend money. Money equals speech. It's not one person, one vote. It's $1, one vote.
Good point.
Good point. Yeah, our bicentennial. So what we have down there with Alan is the start of a terrible metaphor. And we have the metaphor getting more and more tortured, and then it gets to, what's your name?
Court.
Court, okay? And we have this idea, a corporation is a person, and the person of the corporation comes and says, I have all the Bill of Rights protections, and I want the First Amendment right to freedom of speech. Maybe the most sacrosanct and important right that you could have in a functioning democracy. They want that because they have power, money, control of the government, control of the media, lobbyists, cultural cred, and now they say, if we can speak on top of all that, well, we can just waste the competition. And so they said, we speak. And the court said, we would love to agree with you, but we have one problem, which is even we can't figure out a way that we can give you mouths. You don't have mouths. You're not a person. And the corporate lawyer said, oh, that's what we're here for. We speak by spending money. Money is our mouth. So right here, we have the end of democracy. I'm not being facetious. What we have definitionally is a change from one person, one vote to $1, one vote. What is that called? A plutocracy. Corpocracy, fascism, there are lots of words for that. Okay? So it completely perverts the idea that you and I have a say, because if money is speech, then what is poverty? Silence, muteness, right? Okay, so that's a huge problem. So we have the beginnings of, we have had plutocracy in different ways in our history, but we have the institutional legal beginnings of plutocracy right here by corporations spending money in elections. All right, next.
First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, 1977. Corporations use their First Amendment rights to overturn state restrictions on corporate spending on political referenda. Now corporations like Walmart can exponentially outspend organizers on citizens' initiatives that are designed to let everyday people make democratic decisions about their community. This interferes with the most direct form of electoral democracy we have.
That's it. So I've heard a lot about 522, right? The ballot initiative about GMOs. So you guys are organizing as everyday people to say we don't want poisons in our food. They should be labeled at very, very least. And the corporations can say, oh, you want a ballot initiative? That's cute. A ballot initiative meaning that everybody should be able to weigh in. Ballot initiatives brought to us by the populist movement as a form of direct democracy. They say, okay, well, good luck with that ballot initiative when I can dump hundreds of thousands of dollars into defeating it. Millions of dollars from people in Washington.
Into a very polished.
Is the money, right, is the money from people in Washington?
No.
11 million, okay. 5 corporations, $11 million. They don't live here. They don't have to deal with the consequences. So that's what that law was saying. Go for it.
1986, Pacific Gas and Electric Company versus Public Utilities Commission. Although PG&E has a monopoly on utilities in California, they refused to allow an advocacy group to use extra space on their billing envelope to encourage energy conservation. The court sided with PG&E, upholding the corporation's right not to speak and protecting what they called the corporation's freedom of mind.
Great. So PG&E has a monopoly in California on electricity, and so they're essentially a government entity, but they're making a lot of money. And this conservation group says, hey, we think it's pretty risky that you're a corporation who's wanting to make money off of electricity usage, and we want to encourage people to conserve. So we should be able to put something in the envelope that says, hey, turn off your lights sometimes. Pretty small demand. And PG&E says, no, not, in addition to having the right to speak, I also have the right not to speak. And you putting that conservation advice in the newsletter that goes out to everybody in the state, that violates my freedom of mind.
But wait, there's more. 1996, International Dairy Foods Association versus Amstoy. Supreme Court overturns a Vermont law requiring the labeling of all products containing bovine growth hormone, citing the corporation's right not to speak if it would damage their reputation or profit. And this extends, the protection extends to statements of fact as well as statements of opinion? Really? Wow. So no matter what they say, truth, lie, doesn't matter, it's protected.
Exactly. And so, you know, if somebody came in here and said, hey guys, I poisoned all the desserts. Just wanted you to know that. Sorry if you already ate any. And we said, wait a minute, that's terrible. Why didn't you tell us earlier? And they said, oh, I have a right not to speak. We would tell that person, oh, actually, the meeting of the Sociopaths Anonymous is down the hall. Thanks for coming. So, but what we ensconce this in our law and say that corporations can do this to all of us. We don't even have the right to know what to avoid because they have a right not to speak, fact or opinion. All right, next.
2010, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. The Supreme Court reaffirms that a corporation is a person and states that any restrictions on corporate money in elections violates the corporation's First Amendment right to free speech. This ruling overturned most provisions of McCain-Feingold legislation that restricted corporate money in federal elections and reversed a 100-year precedent of congressional authority to regulate federal elections. Opens the floodgates to unlimited corporate spending in elections. $6 billion is spent in the 2012 election cycle. Unlimited money can be spent on elections because it's free speech.
Okay, so there's a boo hiss moment. All right, anybody catch that? So who here came in familiar with Citizens United? Who here thought that it was the first time that the Supreme Court gave corporations human rights? I did. A lot of people do. But what happened before that? So this was the, coup de grace for the Supreme Court, the last and most recent in a series of corporate coups over our democracy. So $6 billion. That's a lot of jelly beans in a jar. I don't need $6 billion to convince you to vote for clean air and a livable planet and well-paying jobs and justice. I need $6 billion if I want to convince you to vote exactly the opposite of the interest of all of your constituents. $6 billion. So let's keep that in mind. And next.
Notice of the right to unionize barred, 2013. Federal Appeals Court struck down a National Labor Relations Board rule requiring that corporations post a poster with information informing workers of their right to form or join a union, to strike, to bargain collectively, and to organize to improve working conditions. The court decided that the rule violated the free speech right of the corporation not to speak and that it punished a corporation for expressing its views, reaffirmed corporate rights at the expense of union rights. And strangely enough, this is not the first time. This is just the latest in a long series of corporations having a right not to speak when it would profit them not to speak.
That's right. So in that, we have an example of when you go to work and you walk into your workplace and shut the door, you have fewer democratic rights than many people in what you would probably consider dictatorial regimes in other countries. And yet the corporations' rights are supreme. Go ahead.
This is McCutcheon versus the FEC, 2013. A wealthy Republican donor has driven a case into the Supreme Court that seeks to overturn laws limiting campaign contributions from individuals. The case threatens to knock down one of the final barriers to legalize bribery, allowing wealthy candidates to give over $3 million to one candidate. The court will decide the case this fall.
All right. So that's, part of the to be continued story. And that doesn't have to explicitly do with corporate personhood. It's about the bigger story we're talking about tonight, which is concentrated wealth in politics and the effect of inequality in the political system. So just out of curiosity, if you want to divulge, who here has $3 million to give to one candidate in the next election? If you do, talk to me. You can donate to Move to Amend instead. $3 million. The Koch brothers spent over $300 million. If $1 equals one vote, that's these corporations or these wealthy individuals voting millions of times. What would you argue for if you had the capacity to talk to your congressperson millions of times? Probably something pretty different than what corporations are arguing for. So we are getting close towards the end of the evening, but I want to do a couple of more things quickly before we end. And so we've answered our first question: why is Move to Amend amending the Constitution to say corporations are not people and money is not speech? We have a series of court cases that gave corporations First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment rights that only human beings should have, and that said that they spent money as a form of speaking. We have to go over the Supreme Court's head and say, the Supreme Court never should have decided these questions. They were wrong on the law, and we, the people, have to reclaim our power over our government so that we can start to make the laws, create the cultures and the structures that actually protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for flesh and blood beings rather than for corporations that exist to make a profit, right? But we also have a broader goal of building a democracy movement across issues that normally divide us or that often divide us. So we're going to do a sped up version of 2 final timelines, and we'll end at about 9:05, that explore why Move to Amend is building a movement and why we're building a movement across these dividing lines. And so what happened to all these people back in the constitutional era that didn't count the first time? They didn't sit around, right? What did they do? They formed movements. So we're going to learn a little bit about movements, and this time we're not going to stop between every card. So we just finished a pretty depressing part of the evening, and this is the part where we feel hopefully inspired again, because people don't take injustice sitting down, they do something about it.
Okay, Bill of Rights, 1791. Outraged revolutionaries reject the Constitution as an elite property document and refuse to ratify it unless it contains basic political protections against the tyranny of the state. Their struggle is successful, and they drive through 10 amendments to the Constitution that protect people's rights to freedom of speech, assembly, religion, and the press, as well as others.
13th Amendment, 1865. Slavery is abolished in the U.S. and any place subject to its jurisdiction.
Civil Rights Act, 1866, extended the rights of emancipated African Americans by stating that any person born in the United States, regardless of race, is a U.S. citizen.
14th Amendment, 1868. African Americans are declared citizens, entitled to equal protection of the laws, essentially banning discrimination.
15th Amendment, 1870, African American males earn the right to vote.
Yeah.
Social change in 1886.
Oh, one comment about this. Social change in 1886. What's relevant about the year 1886? The first time a corporation got the rights of personhood, what was going on in the country?
The year that the Supreme Court first gave corporation rights. This is what the rest of the country was up to. Campaign for the 8-hour workday. Knights of Labor membership 1 million, with 60,000 black and even more women members. Farmers Alliance reaches 100,000 members. Populists draw up founding document to demand debtors' rights and fight the railroad lobby. Eugene Debs builds the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen. Das Kapital by Karl Marx, published in English. Police brutalize labor activists in the Haymarket Massacre.
1913, 17th Amendment, U.S. Senate is now elected by the people instead of appointed by state governments.
19th Amendment, 1920, women finally get the vote after 75 years of struggle.
Jumping up to 1954, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, the Supreme Court recognized that separate was not equal and ruled that public schools cannot be racially segregated.
The 24th Amendment, 1964, abolished poll taxes, which were used to keep blacks and others from voting in some states.
Civil Rights Acts, 1960, established federal inspection of local voter registration polls. 1964, prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin by federal and state governments. 1968, prohibits discrimination in sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, creed, or national origin.
1971, 26th Amendment, voting changed from 21 to 18 years of age, passed to recognize that if 18-year-olds could be drafted into military service, they should be allowed to vote.
Roe v. Wade, 1973. The Supreme Court rules that state statutes against abortion are vague and infringe on a woman's 9th and 14th Amendment rights to privacy. Abortion is legalized in the first trimester of pregnancy.
So how do you all feel after hearing that? Better. So since we have a limited time, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. Did people in power decide one day that African Americans should be emancipated from slavery, women should have the right to vote and not be considered property, and that people of all colors should be protected from discrimination wherever they were? No. What happened? Does law happen in a vacuum? No. What was happening? A social movement. Check out 1886. Pretty exciting year to be alive. Pretty depressing year to be alive if you're a corporation until you get the rights of personhood. It was not an accident that corporations went to the courts to get personhood the same year that people were fomenting all different kinds of structural revolutionary movements around the country. They protected their rights in law because that was their trump card over movements created by people like you and me. So are a bunch of people in suits going to decide in a corporate-occupied Congress that corporations should no longer have the rights of human beings? What is it going to take? Us. How many of us? All of us, lots of us, and a huge, robust movement that are making our demands from our stomachs and our hearts and our brains all at the same time, saying who we are and what we want from the beginning. One more question. Are these movements done? Are women equal? Are black people equal? Did it solve everything? Of course not, right? So a law is only as good as the people who are enforcing it. And I'm not talking about police officers, I'm talking about you and me. A law is only as powerful as the movement behind it. People in power will always try to gut, manipulate, or distort laws for their benefit. So we have to have a powerful movement to protect the laws that we do pass. It's also called a movement because it doesn't end. It's a struggle. It's a movement. We keep moving. And so at Move to Amend, we want to add ourselves onto this beautiful history of people who said no to injustice and yes to equality. One final question about movements. Was the goal of the women's suffrage movement the right to vote? Was that its end goal? Would the right to vote fix hundreds of years of being treated as property and being under misogynist cultures and societies? So what was the goal of the women's movement? Changing consciousness, changing culture. What else? Equality. A voice, justice. Okay, same with the abolitionist movement. Was the goal just the elimination of slavery? For some people it was, and as it went on, they said that's not enough. And it morphed into the civil rights movement and all these other movements for black power, people of color power. And the goal is, once again, justice and equality, right? So is the goal of the Move to Amend movement just to amend the Constitution? What is our goal? Justice. Our amendment is a way to talk about equality and justice with millions of people across the country. So we're going to do one final short timeline, or it's not short, but we'll do it quickly before we go, which is, why do we need to build a democracy movement across race, class, and gender? Why can't we just go to our friends at the country club? I don't have any, but if you do, why can't we go to them and just say, hey, can you get this passed? Why do we need to actually form a movement that addresses and heals the wounds and the consequences of a corporate culture that has created an exacerbated race? In other words, how have elites used the law and the culture to construct differences between us, to make it harder for us to work together? So we're going to do one last timeline and then we're going to close. So I'm going to need about 15 more people to come and read. It's okay if you've already read before. This is a timeline about the way that people, elites, used law and culture to create identities and to ensconce their power over others. This is a hard timeline, and I want to say that if you're reading or if you're in the audience and you need to leave, you can. And I also want to recognize that for many people in the world, we carry this history on our skin and in our bodies and in our minds, and it's very real. So,
an act for preventing Negro insurrection, Act 10, 1680. Blacks are banned from carrying weapons of any kind, and if they presume to physically resist any Christian, they are punished with 30 lashes on his bare back, well laid on. Blacks could also be legally murdered if they are found lurking in obscure places, avoiding labor.
Slave and Servant Codes, 1680 to 1705, established the term slave as equivalent to Negro, while servant now refers only to non-blacks or white persons. Slaves can be accidentally killed by their masters without penalty and are slaves for life along with all their children. In contrast, servants are granted new protections and privileges, including the right to take their masters to court, the right to marry another European immigrant, and the guarantee of a severance pay and a plot of land when freed from service. Black-white marriage is banned and interracial sex is fined.
1830, Indian Removal Act. Indigenous peoples are forced from their homelands east of the Mississippi River. Over 10 years, approximately 100,000 Native children and adults marched thousands of miles west into unknown desert territory. 15,000 people died along the way.
The Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia, 1831. A Cherokee delegation sues the state of Georgia for stripping their people of land and rights. But the court rules they are a domestic dependent nation, unable to claim status in court, validating Cherokee removal and state seizure of their land.
Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. A slave sues his owner for freedom in a state where slavery is banned. The U.S. Supreme Court rules that Negroes are not U.S. citizens under any circumstances and have no rights which any white man is bound to respect. Free blacks are taxed like whites, but receive none of the rights and protections of citizenship.
The Homestead Act of 1862, 50 million acres of formerly indigenous land in the West, seized by U.S. invasion in violation of treaties, is distributed by the government at low cost to white settlers only. An additional 100 million acres of land are given for free to railroad developers.
Minor versus Happersett, 1874. Women argued that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause ensured their right to vote. The Supreme Court rejected their claims, stating that the 14th Amendment only applied to black males, then gave corporations 14th Amendment rights just 12 years later.
Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, bans immigration of both skilled and unskilled Chinese laborers. This act is expanded in 1924 to restrict other Asian immigrants and ban Chinese white marriages in California.
You have to excuse me. I'm Cherokee Choctaw Apache, and that is just so hard to hear. 1924, Johnson-Reed Act creates immigration quota system based on national origin favoring Nordics from Northern and Western Europe over the inferior races of Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe.
National Housing Act, 1934. Following the Great Depression, a federal housing authority is created to provide loans for home ownership. But the FHA standards discriminate against non-whites and deter investment in non-white communities. Known as redlining, this practice boosts the economic value of white neighborhoods relative to non-white neighborhoods.
Social Security Act, 1935. This act provides all-age insurance for the mostly white workforce of certain industries, excluding domestic and agricultural workers who are mostly non-white.
Japanese American internment, 1942. Forces all Japanese American and Japanese residents living on the west coast of the U.S. into unsanitary, fenced concentration camps called war relocation camps. Over 111,000 people are interned, 62% of them American citizens.
GI Bill 1944. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act offers education and housing subsidies to returning war veterans, but severe social discrimination, poverty, and lack of education prevents black veterans from receiving these benefits, while white veterans benefit disproportionately.
War on Drugs, 1971. President Richard Nixon declares a war on drugs, disproportionately and violently targets economically impoverished communities of color for the next 40 years, leading to mass incarceration for drug-related offenses. White populations are relatively unaffected.
NYPD Stop and Frisk, 2011. In 2011, New York City's discriminatory stop and frisk program continues to escalate, with over 680,000 public police stops made on the street, and 84% of those stops being blacks or Latinos. Justified as a gun control measure, less than 0.2% of stops turn up guns, while 88% of stops result in no charges at all.
So why do we need to build a multiracial movement across class and across gender lines. For justice. So because none of us are immune, and because many of us have been disproportionately harmed and wounded by the system for hundreds of years. So for me, the question is, what is it going to be? There is never a time in our country's history that was democratic for the majority of people. There's no age of original innocence to go back to. There was always the struggle between the people with money and power and the people who wore the harms of that money and power on their bodies and in their lives, and who formed movements to say that they had dignity and the state had to recognize it. And so for us, the question is the same. What is it going to be? Moneyed interests control our lives in the form of powerful corporations that have taken over our government. We wear those wounds on our bodies, and people of color communities and poor communities and women and disenfranchised people wear those wounds disproportionately. If we are going to win the amendment, we have to have all of these people. If we are going to win justice, we have to listen to these people and to listen to each other tell the stories of how corporations and money and power has harmed us over time. And we have to build a movement that is so powerful and so filled with those stories that we can't be stopped. And that's why I'm part of Move to Amend, because the constitutional amendment is part of a broader question about what it would look like for 95% of the people who didn't count the first time to have a real and actual say in something that was actually a democracy. And I think that one of the most important cards on that timeline is the Slave and Servant Code card, where they created a term for white people and a term, or the servant for white people and slave for black people. They did that to divide us so that the people with a little bit more power would spend all of our time fighting the people with a little bit less, so that we'd never look at the top of the pyramid and see who was controlling it all. So it's time for us to come together and look at the top of the pyramid, name that problem, name it as unjust, and do something about it. So I hope that you join with Move to Amend, and I hope you join with WAmend to actually start feeling your own power again, and to be serious about that power and what it means, and to believe that you can form power collectively to eliminate and to undo even the grossest injustices, remembering that the women's suffrage movement went into a male-exclusive Congress saying that they were people, human beings, that had to be recognized by law. And they fought and they fought and they fought, and I'm here today as a beneficiary of that fight. The fact that I can do certain things and say certain things and think certain things is a result of their struggle. And so I hope, that timeline always makes me very emotional, and this idea makes me emotional. And so we know that we live in a world that is completely dominated by corporations and corporate interests, and we are going into a corporate-occupied Congress, and we are saying, we demand an amendment. We are not asking, we're demanding justice, and we're gonna do it together. And please join the movement, and please add your experience and your story and your power and your voice to the movement. And please join WAmend in their effort to collect over 300,000 signatures to get on the ballot. It is possible, and it is scary at first to talk to somebody about how you feel, but once you start doing it, my experience is that it's incredibly liberating, because people don't want us to feel our own power. People in power don't want us to feel our power, because it's pretty intoxicating, and you want to keep talking, and you want to keep organizing, and you want to keep coming together. So please join that, and we're ending a little bit late, but we'll still break, and we'll have some questions and conversations back there. Yeah, is that what you were going to say? Okay, so thank you.